St. Mary's Hospital. Once a sprawling edifice of brick and ivy, its shadow stretched long under the oppressive weight of its history. The building itself seemed to sag, burdened by the weight of years and whispered tales. Locals told stories, hushed and hurried, of the spirits that roamed its halls. Patients claimed to hear whispers when no one was there, to see shadows shift at the edge of their vision. Nurses spoke of cold spots, of equipment malfunctioning in ways that defied logic. But the hospital staff, hardened by years of long nights and human suffering, brushed it off. Just old building groans, they'd say, tired minds playing tricks. But tonight a chill settled deeper than usual. Tonight the whispers grew louder. Tonight the legend of St. Mary's would be reborn. The ticking clock appeared loud at 22:08 hours, its rhythmic clicking the only sound that dared break the silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unsettling glow on the empty corridors. Nurse Sarah glanced at the time in the corner of her screen, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. It was the start of her shift in the intensive care unit, the ICU. Usually, the bustle of the hospital, even at night, offered a strange comfort. Tonight, an unnatural stillness hung in the air, heavy and expectant. As Sarah walked down the eerily quiet hallway, her footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every rustle of wind against the window sounded like a whisper. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the door handle of the ICU, a wave of dread washing over her. What awaited her on the other side of that door, she couldn't have known. The ICU was eerily quiet. The usual beeping of monitors and hushed murmurs of nurses were absent, replaced by a profound silence. 3 nurses, faces etched with exhaustion, huddled around a computer screen. Sarah recognized Mark, a seasoned nurse, and Emily, a bright-eyed newcomer. Their faces, illuminated by the monitor, were drawn and pale. "Quiet, isn't it?" Sarah remarked, breaking the tension. Mark chuckled humorlessly, eyes on the screen. "Quiet before the storm," he muttered. "Full moon tonight." Emily shivered, giving herself an uneasy hug. A low hum resonated, lights flickering momentarily. The hairs on Sarah's neck stood on end. The unease intensified, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The air grew colder as the night wore on, a damp chill that seeped into the very marrow. The silence, once unsettling, was now almost unbearable, punctuated by the occasional bang of a distant door or the unnerving hum of the fluorescent lights. Sarah found herself jumping at every little sound, her heart pounding in her chest. It was during one of her routine checks on Mr. Henderson, an elderly man recovering from a heart attack, that she noticed something strange. As she adjusted his IV drip, her gaze fell on the reflection in the stainless steel medical tray. For a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing behind her, a tall, gaunt silhouette shrouded in darkness. She whirled around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there. "Just your imagination playing tricks on you," she muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper. but the image of the shadowy figure lingered in her mind's eye, sending shivers down her spine. A blood-curdling scream pierced the oppressive silence, echoing through the hallway. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat, her blood turning to ice. She exchanged a horrified look with Emily, both of them instantly on high alert. "What was that?" Emily gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Before Sarah could answer, the frantic voice of Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery, reached their ears. "My husband, he's gone! He was right here a moment ago, and now he's vanished!" They rushed towards her room, their hearts pounding in unison with the frantic beeping of a nearby IV alarm. The room was in disarray, the bedside table overturned, a glass of water shattered on the floor. Mrs. Peterson, her face pale and contorted with fear, clutched at her gown, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for her missing husband. "We've searched everywhere," Mark said, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and growing unease. "There's no sign of Mr. Peterson anywhere. It's like he vanished into thin air." Sarah's gaze swept over the chaotic scene, her mind racing. The impossible seemed to have occurred right before their eyes. It was then that she noticed it. A palpable chill emanating from the doorway of room 13, the only room in the unit that remained unoccupied. The air around the door seemed to shimmer and distort, a black void swallowing the light. A strange pull drew her towards it, a morbid curiosity overriding her fear. "What is it, Sarah?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, "but I think we need to see." The door creaked open as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. A wave of icy air washed over them, sending shivers down their spines. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something unidentifiable yet distinctly unsettling. The room was bare, stripped of its usual medical equipment, the bed neatly made, untouched. The only light came from the hallway, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. "There's nothing here," Emily whispered, her voice tight with apprehension, but Sarah felt it, a presence, cold and unseen, lurking in the shadows. Her breath hitched in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The temperature plummeted as they stood there, the air growing thick and oppressive. Sarah could see her breath misting in front of her face. Mark, his face pale and drawn, pulled out the thermometer he always carried and held it up. The reading dropped rapidly, the mercury plunging below freezing point. This doesn't make sense," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "It's not possible for the temperature to drop this low in here." A cold wind seemed to whip through the room, though the windows were sealed shut. The shadows on the walls danced more violently, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. A low hum resonated from the walls, growing louder with each passing second. It seemed to vibrate through their very bones, shaking them to their core. Sarah felt an icy hand grip her arm, its touch sending a jolt of terror through her entire body. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. Did you feel that?" she gasped, her voice trembling. Mark and Emily exchanged a look of pure horror. They had felt it too. The presence in the room was growing stronger, more malevolent. And then, they saw it. A shadowy figure began to coalesce in the far corner of the room, its form indistinct yet undeniably present. Panic surged through Sarah, threatening to overwhelm her. She had to get out of there to escape the suffocating presence that seemed to be closing in on them. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fear. "Now!" They stumbled back towards the door, their eyes never leaving the shadowy figure that seemed to be watching their every move. As they fled the room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something evil had taken root in the very walls of St. Mary's Hospital. Driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for answers, they sought refuge in the deserted nurses' station, frantically searching through medical textbooks and patient files, hoping to find some explanation, some clue to the horrors that were unfolding around them. But the truth, as they were about to discover, was far more terrifying than anything they could have ever imagined. The air hung thick with the smell of dust and decay as Sarah, Mark, and Emily descended deeper into the bowels of the hospital. They had sought refuge in the old archives, a forgotten labyrinth of forgotten medical records and decaying texts, hoping to find some answers to the horrors that plagued St. Mary's. Cobwebs clung to their faces, the only sound their own ragged breaths and the echo of their footsteps on the cold, hard floor. Sarah ran her fingers along the spines of ancient, leather-bound volumes, their titles barely visible in the dim light. "Do you really think we'll find anything down here?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. "It's just a bunch of old junk. We have to try something," Sarah replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "There has to be an explanation for what's happening." Hours melted away as they sifted through the endless rows of files, their fingers tracing over faded ink and brittle parchment. The weight of the hospital's history pressed down on them, the silence broken only by the occasional cough or the rustle of ancient paper. Just when their hope began to dwindle, Sarah stumbled upon a file, tucked away in the back of a dusty shelf. The label, barely legible, simply read, "Room 13, Incident Report." Her heart pounded in her chest as she carefully opened the file, its contents yellowed with age but still chillingly clear. The report detailed a series of unexplained events, mirroring their own terrifying experiences, that had culminated in the disappearance of a patient and the doctor assigned to his care. And then she saw it. A name scrawled at the bottom of the report, its letters jagged and uneven, as if written in a moment of sheer terror. Dr. Henry Blackwood. As Sarah read on, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Dr. Blackwood, a brilliant but eccentric physician, had become obsessed with a patient in room 13, convinced he held the key to unlocking the mysteries of the human soul. The doctor's notes, filled with frantic scribbles and disturbing diagrams, hinted at forbidden experiments, at a desire to push the boundaries of life and death. And then, the entries abruptly stopped, replaced by a single chilling sentence, written in a hand, not his own. "He has become one with the darkness." The accompanying illustrations, crude but vivid, depicted a chaotic scene in room 13, with medical instruments scattered across the floor and a shadowy figure towering over a terrified Dr. Blackwood. The final image showed the room empty, the doctor gone without a trace. The truth, as it slowly dawned on Sarah, was far more horrifying than anything they could have imagined. Dr. Blackwood's hubris, his thirst for forbidden knowledge, had awakened a malevolent entity, a being of pure darkness that fed on the life force of the living. The entity had chosen room 13 as its conduit, its power growing stronger with each passing year, and now it seemed it had set its sights on new victims. As Sarah shared her terrifying discovery with Mark and Emily, a cold realization washed over them. They were not just dealing with a haunting, but with something far more ancient, far more evil. The entity that stalked the halls of St. Mary's was not a ghost, but a predator, and they were its prey. Trapped in the hospital's depths with a malevolent entity, their only hope lay in unraveling the secrets of Dr. Blackwood's research before the darkness consumed them all. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah, the weight of the entity's presence bearing down on her. She stumbled back from the desk, dropping the file to the floor. It lay there, open, the ink seeming to bleed into the ancient parchment as if alive. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat, and then she saw it. A strange mark had appeared on her arm, a dark, swirling pattern that pulsed with an eerie inner light. It burned like ice, sending chills down her spine. It was the same symbol, she realized with a growing sense of dread, that Dr. Blackwood had drawn in his notes. The entity had marked her. Section 2. The Hunt Begins. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the archives, a primal sound of terror that sent chills down their spines. It was Emily. They whirled around to see her cowering against a bookshelf, her eyes wide with terror, her finger pointing towards the entrance. A shadowy figure flickered in the doorway, its edges indistinct, yet its malevolence palpable. The entity had found them. "We have to go," Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her towards a narrow side corridor. They sprinted through the labyrinthine hallways, their footsteps echoing through the silence, the entity's presence looming behind them like a predator stalking its prey. The air grew colder, the scent of decay intensifying, as if the hospital itself was closing in on them, urging the entity forward. They could hear its low growl reverberating through the walls, drawing closer, relishing the fear that pulsed through their veins. They found themselves in a small, windowless room, its walls covered in strange symbols and diagrams illuminated by a single flickering light bulb. It was Dr. Blackwood's secret laboratory, hidden deep within the bowels of the hospital. The air hung thick with the scent of chemicals and something ancient, something unsettling. Books and papers lay scattered across the floor, remnants of the doctor's desperate research. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her voice choked with fear. "We're trapped." Sarah's eyes scanned the room, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything. And then she saw it. A large, ornate mirror, its silver tarnished with age, hung on the far wall. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But according to Dr. Blackwood's notes, mirrors could disrupt the entity's energy, weaken its hold. It might be their only chance. The entity's growl echoed closer, shaking the very foundations of the hospital. They could feel its icy breath on their necks, smell the decay that clung to its unseen form. "The mirror!" Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible above the entity's guttural roar. She grabbed the heavy frame, her muscles screaming in protest, and with a final desperate heave, she turned it to face the approaching darkness. The entity recoiled as if burned, its form flickering in the tarnished reflection. A high-pitched whine filled the air, a sound of pure rage and agony. The shadows in the room writhed and danced, the air crackled with raw power. They had wounded it, but how long could they hold it at bay? The mirror was beginning to crack, the silver spiderwebbing under the strain of the entity's rage. They were running out of time. Their only hope now lay in understanding the true nature of the entity. The fate of St. Mary's Hospital hung precariously in the balance. Panic threatened to consume them, but Sarah clung to the last vestiges of hope. Dr. Blackwood's frantic scribblings, once indecipherable, now seemed to burn with a terrible clarity in her mind. The entity, she realized, wasn't invincible. It drew its power from the hospital's dark history, from the suffering and despair that had seeped into its very walls. She scanned the room, her eyes falling on a heavy, leather-bound journal lying open on the floor. It was Blackwood's personal log, filled with even more disturbing sketches and cryptic entries. One page, marked with a faded bloodstain, detailed a ritual, a desperate attempt to sever the entity's connection to the physical plane. "There's a way," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse with both fear and determination. "Blackwood, he found a way to fight back." Mark and Emily huddled closer, their faces pale in the flickering light. The entity's rage echoed around them, the mirror groaning under the strain. Time was running out. Following Blackwood's chilling instructions, they gathered the necessary components for the ritual. Candles, salt, a silver scalpel, and a lock of hair from a willing participant. Emily, her face ashen but resolute, volunteered. They arranged the items around the room's center, forming a circle of protection, a beacon of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The air crackled with energy as Sarah, her voice echoing with newfound strength, recited the ancient words Blackwood had transcribed, each syllable a nail hammered into the entity's coffin. The room grew colder, the shadows pressing in, as the entity sensed their intentions. The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, shards of silver raining upwards before falling down around them like icy tears. The entity's form, now fully visible, loomed before them, a grotesque mockery of human form, its eyes burning with malevolent fury. A blinding flash of white light engulfed the room, followed by an ear-splitting silence. The air, once thick with dread and malevolence, felt lighter, cleansed. The entity was gone. Sarah, Mark, and Emily lay sprawled on the floor, their bodies battered and bruised, but alive. The silence, once deafening, now brought a strange sense of peace. St. Mary's Hospital stood eerily quiet, the halls empty, the whispers silenced. The entity was gone, its grip on the hospital broken, leaving behind only the faintest echo of its terror. The ordeal had taken its toll. Mark, his face etched with the horrors he had witnessed, resigned the next day, seeking solace in the quiet life he had left behind. Emily, forever changed by her encounter with the darkness, dedicated herself to her patients, finding strength in their resilience. And Sarah, she stayed on at St. Mary's, forever bound to the hospital and its secrets. She continued her work, her hands steady, her gaze unwavering, but a part of her remained forever in that room, forever haunted by the entity's chilling presence. The legend of St. Mary's Hospital lived on, whispered in hushed tones by the nurses on the night shift, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the ordinary. Some things, Sarah learned, could never be truly erased. They lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface, to remind us that even in the sterile, clinical world of medicine, the line between life and death, between the real and the supernatural, was terrifyingly thin, and sometimes, all it took was a single, chilling whisper in the dark to shatter the illusion of safety altogether.